Can you believe that the man who controlled half of the world's entire supply of gold, the very king whose presence triggered a financial catastrophe that destabilized international markets for a decade, began his life as a curse, a child who couldn't even stand up straight?
This is not just history. This is the true, terrifying legend of the Mali Empire, a civilization so vast, so rich, and so spectacularly powerful that when it finally crumbled, the desert swallowed its secrets whole, leaving only whispers of unimaginable wealth behind.
Tonight we are deep into the belly of the beast, stripping away the sanitized textbook versions to reveal the blood, the magic, and the high-stakes political intrigue that birthed the golden age of West Africa, an age that changed the global balance of power forever. But before Mansa Musa and his legendary caravan of 60,000 men and mountains of pure metal, there was absolute darkness. The founding story of Mali is not one of slow, steady growth, but of a sudden, violent reaction to a catastrophic national trauma, a nightmare that nearly extinguished the Mandinka people from the face of the earth. The year is roughly 1218, and across the savannas a shadow had fallen, cast by the most terrifying villain the region had ever known, Sumanguru Kante, the Sorcerer King of the Soso Empire. Sumanguru was less a ruler and more a force of nature, a tyrant whose legend was steeped in dark magic and grotesque displays of power, a man said to wear the flayed skin of his enemies into battle, whose armies moved with the silent, deadly precision of a desert storm. He had one goal: total, brutal domination. And to achieve it, he orchestrated the systematic extermination of rival royal lines, wiping entire dynasties from existence in a chilling campaign of ritual murder and political cleansing. The Mandinka people, proud inhabitants of the small but strategically important kingdom of Kangaba, felt the full, unforgiving weight of his boot when Sumanguru's hordes descended upon their capital in a shocking, swift assault. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was the intended cultural annihilation of a people, designed to leave no leader, no hope, and no future for the Mandinka nation. Amidst the chaos and the burning ruins, there was one boy, one surviving heir, who was dismissed as utterly irrelevant, a crippled child named Sundiata Keita, the son of the king's second wife, Sologan. Sumanguru, in his hubris, looked at this weak, crawling boy and decided he posed zero threat, deeming him unworthy of the executioner's blade, a monumental oversight that would become the single greatest strategic mistake in the history of medieval Africa. He believed he had destroyed the royal bloodline. He believed he had broken the Mandinka spirit. He believed the golden heart of West Africa was his to plunder. But he failed to account for the supernatural fury that was brewing inside the soul of that ridiculed, paralyzed prince. This rejection
This humiliation was the catalyst. It was the moment that the history books fail to capture, the internal earthquake that forged the first true emperor of Mali. Sundiata was forced into exile, carrying the weight of his family's disgrace and the crushing burden of his people's survival across hostile lands, hunted by Sumanguru's assassins at every turn. Every single breath he took was an act of defiance. Every mile he traveled was a testament to a destiny he could not yet physically claim, but which burned hotter than the Saharan sun in his mind. Imagine the pressure, a fugitive boy, crippled by fate, carrying the entire hope of a destroyed nation on his back, knowing that if he failed, his people would simply cease to exist, condemned to eternal slavery under the demonic sorcerer king. But then, something impossible happened. Something that historians still struggle to explain through mere political science. Something that smells heavily of ancient magic and divine intervention. The boy who couldn't walk, the despised heir, found his power. He found his legs. And when he stood up, the entire world trembled, because the Lion King of Mali had finally risen, ready to reclaim his destiny and unleash a financial plague of gold upon the unsuspecting world. But first he had to face the man who wore human skin. He had to face Sumanguru, and the final confrontation that followed wasn't just a battle. It was an epic clash of titans, where iron met magic, and the fate of an entire continent hung on the swing of one newly strengthened, vengeance-fueled sword. This is the story of how the weakest prince became the strongest king, how a dust-choked village became the source of global wealth, and how a catastrophe no one saw coming birthed the greatest empire Africa has ever known. The catastrophe wasn't a famine or a flood. It was a man, a creature of shadow and steel, whose name was whispered only in the deepest, darkest corners of the savannah. Sumanguru Kante, the Iron King of Sasso. He wasn't just a general. He was a sorcerer of imaginable power, a figure so terrifying that legend claims he wore human skin as his armor, and used the skulls of defeated kings as drums to announce his arrival across the terrified landscape. Sumanguru's Soso Empire was not built on treaties or trade routes. It was forged in the fire of absolute conquest and maintained by pure, unrelenting psychological terror. He had mastered the dark arts, controlling jinn and spirits, making him utterly invincible in the eyes of the fragmented Mandinka tribes who still clung to their ancient, peaceful ways. His capital city, Soso, was less a place of government and more a dark fortress of relentless industry, churning out iron weaponry at a terrifying industrialized rate, giving his soldiers an edge the local decentralized kings simply couldn't match in 1,000 years of traditional blacksmithing. The Mandinka heartland,
The small ancient kingdom of Kangaba was a peaceful, if disorganized, collection of farming villages and minor chiefs, utterly unprepared for the hurricane that was Sumanguru. When he struck, the fragile peace of the savannah shattered like thin ice under the apocalyptic blow of a warhammer wielded by a giant. Sundiata's great hunter-king father, Magan Kon Fata, was already gone, removed by the cold hand of fate. That stabilizing force was instantly removed, leaving a power vacuum filled instantly by greed, betrayal, political infighting, and, ultimately, the overwhelming mechanized force of the Soso army that marched like the very shadow of death itself. Sumanguru's strategy was chillingly simple and brutally effective. Decapitate the leadership, dismantle the ruling structure, and scatter the royal lineage so thoroughly that they could never coalesce again. Sundiata, the lame child, the one everyone ignored, the one who couldn't stand on his own 2 feet, was the fortunate, yet miserable, consequence of this calculated negligence. His mother, Sagalon, the buffalo woman, a figure of quiet, immense dignity and enduring, silent pain, had no choice but to flee. She took her children and led them into the unforgiving wilderness, becoming desperate, powerless refugees in the very land their ancestors had ruled with honor and justice for centuries. These were not glamorous years of heroic training. They were years of grinding, soul-crushing humiliation that chipped away at any remaining pride. They bounced tragically from court to court, from the tiny kingdom of Nima to the historically great but now diminished court of Ghana, always unwelcome, always observers on the periphery, never participants in the great decisions of the day. Sundiata grew up listening to the constant, poisoned whispers that followed them like a hungry vulture. The lion who cannot walk. He was the butt of every cruel joke, the subject of pity parties he dared not attend, and the living embodiment of his family's catastrophic failure. Imagine the future emperor of the world, the man destined to command armies of thousands and control the flow of global gold, having to listen to petty chieftains insult his mother and dismiss his very existence as a worthless burden on their meager hospitality. Every single meal they ate was charity. Every single day was a raw, stinging reminder of his physical weakness and his ancient kingdom's brutal, total loss. The emotional toll was immense, yet crucial. But while his body remained frustratingly weak, something profound and irreversible was happening within the soul of the exiled prince. Every insult, every cold night spent outside a royal tent, every single drop of his mother's silent, enduring tears was not eroding him or breaking his spirit. It was hardening him, forging the internal steel of an unyielding, unbreakable resolve that would become his true strength. The mandinka griots, the living libraries and historians of the people, kept the secret alive, murmuring the ancient words only in the safety of darkness. The prophecies spoke of a hero, not a perfect, physically magnificent king, but one whose suffering would sharpen him into the ultimate, necessary weapon against tyranny. The people, crushed utterly under the Saso yoke, began to look beyond their immediate, desperate suffering. They needed a symbol. They needed a miracle. They needed the impossible king who was currently wandering the edges of the known world, polishing his destiny in relentless obscurity and exile. The darkness was absolute and total. Sumanguru had conquered everything of worth. There was absolutely no hope left in the immediate future, which, paradoxically, was exactly what gave the crippled boy the necessary blank canvas to paint his masterpiece across the savannah. They were desperately praying for a traditional king, a powerful warrior, but fate was sending them something far more potent and dangerous, a god forged in the crucible of exile, who knew the pain of his people intimately. This was the devastating world Sundiata inherited. Absolute ruin, absolute terror, and absolute crushing expectation. The time for whispering and hiding was over. The time for the lion to roar was terrifyingly, wonderfully coming. The ground trembled, not just from the hooves of the horses carrying the fleeing royal family, but from the sheer, crushing weight of destiny. Sundiata Keita, the boy who could not walk until he had to, was now leading a desperate flight into the unknown, a flicker of light against the oppressive darkness of the sorcerer king, Sumanguru. Every shadow held the potential for a Kankaran Suman spy, a viper sent by the jealous tyrant who sought not just the throne, but the utter annihilation of the Keita line, believing their extinction was the only way to secure his own dark reign forever. They carried with them only what they could wear, and the heavy, burdensome promise of the prophecy, a promise that felt more like a curse in the face of Sumanguru's overwhelming power. For years, they were political refugees, traveling eastward, seeking sanctuary in courts far removed from the heart of the Mandinka terror. This journey was not a retreat. It was a brutal, necessary education. Sundiata, along with his mother Sogalan, found crucial, temporary shelter in the court of the king of Mema, a kingdom situated at a critical crossroads of trade and power. This foreign court became Sundiata's private university of war and statecraft, forcing the boy who had once crawled to stand tall and prove his immense potential. He didn't just survive, he mastered the bow, the spear, and most importantly, the complex, deadly dance of diplomacy, watching the mechanics of a successful kingdom from the periphery. While other exiled princes might have wallowed in self-pity, Sundiata was meticulously building a network of alliances across the fractured West African landscape, proving that true power was not inherited, but earned through respect and strategic foresight. He shed the cloak of the cripple and donned the armor of the leader, his silent observation transforming into magnetic charisma. His body hardened, his mind sharpened. His aura radiated the undeniable gravity
of a true king, a terrifying maturation that Sumanguru, blinded by his own sorcery and hubris, failed entirely to detect, dismissing the scattered refugees as merely irritating gnats. Meanwhile, back in the ancestral Mandinka homeland, the iron grip of Sumanguru tightened until the very air cracked under the pressure of his tyranny. The Sorcerer King was not content merely to rule. He desired total spiritual dominance, seizing the sacred drums of the Mandinka and demanding tribute so crippling that starvation became a common sight in the proud villages of the savannah. His cruelty was legendary, rooted in a terrifying fusion of military might and dark magic. They whispered that he wore the skin of his victims into battle, and that his fortress was built on bones, ensuring obedience through paralyzing, supernatural fear. He had seized control of the crucial salt trade routes, the literal lifeblood of the savannah economy, starving the population into submission while hoarding the vast gold reserves. The Mandinka elders and chiefs, subjugated and humiliated by the constant demands and the sacrilege of their tyrant, realized they had made a terrible, fatal mistake by allowing the tyranny to take root. They needed a savior, not a replacement king, and that savior was hundreds of miles away, honing his claws in exile. The catalyst for action arrived when Sumanguru, in a final act of grotesque political theater, publicly humiliated and executed members of the remaining royal families who dared to question his tax demands, scattering their ashes to the wind as a symbol of his absolute, unchallenged authority. The message was clear. Resistance meant obliteration. But desperation breeds courage, and the desperate whispers of resistance finally coalesced into a unified, burning plea for deliverance. A desperate, secret envoy, comprised of the most trusted and resourceful griots and elders, was dispatched, traversing perilous, enemy-infested territories, driven by the singular, burning hope that the exiled lion was ready to come home and claim his birthright. They found Sundiata not lounging in a royal palace, but leading Mema's armies with devastating tactical brilliance, displaying a mastery of strategy that stunned the local commanders. He had proven his worth on the battlefield, not just by strength, but by profound wisdom. When the elders finally knelt before him, delivering the desperate plea of a dying nation, "Return, O son of the buffalo woman, and save us from the night," the transformation was complete. The flicker of hope that had sustained them through exile became a blazing, unstoppable sun of righteous fury. Sundiata didn't hesitate. He knew the cost. He knew the impossibility of fighting a king who could control the weather and transform into 100 beasts. But he also knew the prophecy had to be fulfilled. He accepted the mantle, not just of king, but of revolutionary leader. His genius immediately shone through. He demanded immediate, unequivocal commitment from the remaining Mandinka clans, forging a covenant of unity that transcended ancient rivalries and clan feuds. This unity was the first and most powerful weapon against Sumanguru's divide-and-conquer strategy. He secured the loyalty of crucial neighboring regions, utilizing the deep, patient alliances he had forged during his years of patient exile, proving that politics, sealed with trust and shared vision, could be a more powerful force than 1,000 spears. The army he assembled was unlike any seen before in West Africa. It was a terrifying kaleidoscope of warriors. Archers from Mema, disciplined cavalry from the southern clans, and thousands of desperate, vengeful commoners who had lost everything to Sumanguru's tyrannical tax collectors. The march back to the Mandinka heartland was not a panicked flight, but a slow, deliberate display of overwhelming force and absolute confidence. A psychological weapon aimed directly at the morale of the Sorcerer King's already nervous garrison commanders, who feared their master's cruelty more than death itself. Every village they passed erupted in celebration, offering food, men, and crucial intelligence, fueling the momentum of a liberation movement that was rapidly spiraling out of Sumanguru's control, the very idea of hope becoming contagious and deadly to the tyrant's regime. Sumanguru, hearing the reports of the gathering storm, reports that spoke not of an army, but of a legend returning, leading a truly unified force, finally recognized the catastrophic, mortal error he had made years earlier, when he allowed the mother and son to slip away from his murderous grasp. He mobilized his terrifying forces, readying his army of iron and his cadre of dark sorcerers, preparing for a confrontation that would not be won by iron or men alone, but by a final, terrifying clash of spiritual power, a battle that would decide the fate of the entire known world. The air itself was poisoned by Sumanguru's reign. His capital city of Soso wasn't built with bricks and mortar. It was erected on a foundation of terror, held together by the screams of his victims and the dark magic whispered by the jinn he commanded. They said his throne room smelled of scorched earth and blood, and that the shadows in the corner were not mere darkness, but the watchful eyes of ancient, malevolent spirits waiting for his command. Sundiata, the Lion King who had once been the crippled boy, understood this reality better than anyone. He knew that the iron strength of his army, though fierce, was simply not enough to pierce the magical shield that protected the king of Soso. Sundiata's strategy became terrifyingly complex. Military precision combined with spiritual enlightenment. A coalition not just of men, but of destiny itself. He had to convince dozens of hesitant, fractured Mande clan leaders, the very people Sumanguru had terrorized into submission, that defying the Iron King was not immediate suicide, but the only path to survival for their children and their gods. He traveled like a ghost through the terrified savannah, carrying only the promise of freedom and the absolute conviction of his own undeniable royal bloodline. The first great victory wasn't a battle won with swords.
It was the sacred oath he struck with the Mandan clans at the legendary site of Kaaba. This was the moment the disparate tribes transformed from frightened, scattered subjects into the unwavering core of the unified Mali state, swearing allegiance to the sacred banner of the lion. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were a movement, galvanized by the shared, burning memory of the atrocities committed by the Soso king, a collective fury ready to erupt.
He strategically courted the hunter societies. And the blacksmiths, two groups critical to both military might and spiritual defense. The blacksmiths, historically revered as masters of both metal and magic, held unique knowledge about the spiritual properties of iron, a material Sumanguru both relied upon and feared. Their loyalty was a tectonic shift in the balance of power, granting sundiata access to sacred knowledge and superior weaponry. Every single alliance required a risk of exposure, a high-stakes diplomatic gamble played while Sumanguru's terrifying scouts, demonic riders who left no tracks, patrolled the dust-choked routes. Meanwhile, in the supposedly impregnable fortress of Soso, Sumanguru laughed with cruel amusement. He saw Sundata as a minor, persistent irritation, a buzzing fly that would soon be swatted down by the casual flick of his sorcerer's hand. He had his great balafon, the sacred xylophone of power. Which pulsed with the dark energy that not only fortified his city walls, but supposedly bent the will of lesser men and twisted the weather itself. Sumanguru believed his powerful sorcery made him absolutely untouchable. He had enslaved the very spirits of the earth, forcing them into brutal service to fuel his twisted ambition and ensure his absolute physical immortality on the battlefield. He deployed reconnaissance forces, skirmishers who moved like horrifying phantoms, riding horses whose hooves were magically wrapped in silence, scouting the growing rebel army, confirming the numbers, but failing utterly to grasp the spiritual gravity of what Sundiata was building. But Sundiata had a secret weapon, not made of steel or magic, but of ancient, forgotten knowledge retrieved by his loyal griots. These living historians and spiritual advisors, risking fiery death, had uncovered the terrifying, hidden truth. Sumanguru was indeed immortal on the battlefield, protected by powerful ancient totems, unless a specific counter-totem was used against him. His invincibility rested entirely on the power of the Great Duga, a dark ritual that demanded constant bloody sacrifice, but which also created a single fatal flaw in his otherwise flawless magical armor. The counterspell, the only thing that could sever his link to the dark earth spirits, required the spur of a white cock, a seemingly mundane object imbued with the potent power of purity and the complete antithesis of Sumanguru's chaotic, bloody energy. This crucial, life-saving knowledge was delivered under the cover of night, whispered into Sundiata's ear by the last loyalists who had managed to escape the immediate horrors of Soso, risking everything to hand over the literal key to the tyrant's defeat.
The final mobilization was a sight that shook the savannah floor and sent shockwaves across the entire region. The Mande forces, now known as the Nyani warriors, marched east across the arid lands towards the wide plains of Kerina, the location chosen by fate for the ultimate deciding confrontation. The sound of their war drums was not merely a beat. It was a deafening, rhythmic heartbeat of absolute defiance against the suffocating silence of tyranny that had ruled them for so long.
Every single man knew that the upcoming battle would decide whether they lived out their days as free, sovereign men or died immediately as sacrifices upon Sumanguru's perpetually blood-soaked altars. The sheer, colossal weight of destiny pressed down relentlessly on Sundiata's young shoulders. He was leading an army of the desperate against a king who commanded the very laws of physics and the spirits beneath the ground.
The odds were astronomical, impossible, yet the collective fire in their eyes, the shared, searing memory of oppression and lost kin, fueled their every single, desperate step. The morning mist over Kerina was thick, cold, and utterly ominous, waiting patiently for the torrential blood that would inevitably soak the earth and forever change the color of the soil. Sumanguru's army, the Soso legions, stood silently waiting on the opposite side, their armor black as dried blood, their faces hidden behind masks. Sumanguru's army, the Soso legions, stood silently waiting on the opposite side, their armor black as dried blood, their faces hidden behind masks of cold iron and pure malice. This was not merely a battle for territory or trade routes. This was the final, devastating war between the mortal realm seeking freedom and the dark sorcery that threatened to swallow it whole and condemn all future generations. The shadow of Sumanguru, the blacksmith king, was not merely a political problem. It was an atmospheric dread that suffocated the air across the entire savannah. His magic was fueled by the fear of the oppressed, and every captured village added another tremor of power to his dark arsenal. People spoke his name in whispers, praying that the wind would not carry the sound back to his fortified city of Soso, a place built on bones and enforced by unimaginable terror, where iron was sacred and humanity was disposable. Sumanguru ruled with absolute certainty, believing his lineage and his command over the dark jinn made him untouchable. He collected not just taxes, but the dignity and the very souls of those he conquered, melting down their histories and forging them into instruments of his own perpetual tyranny. The Mandinka people, scattered and broken, seemed destined to fade into a footnote of history, crushed under the heel of the sociopathic sorcerer king, who commanded legions of heavily armored, fanatically loyal warriors. But in the desolate lands, far from the direct, suffocating reach of the Soso armies, a different kind of power was secretly and rapidly coalescing. Sundiata Keita, the lion child, had spent years in exile, not in hiding, but in relentless, focused preparation, knowing that the clock was ticking down to zero. In the court of Mema, under the watchful yet highly nervous eyes of the king, he had grown from a hesitant, ridiculed boy into a magnificent spear-wielding warrior whose presence commanded immediate respect, bordering on pure awe. He learned the rhythm of the brutal battlefield, the crucial timing of the cavalry charge, and the subtle, deadly language of diplomacy, mastering the arts of war and governance simultaneously. He was not just physically powerful. His mind was a strategic engine, capable of seeing moves ahead that his enemies, distracted by petty power grabs, could never comprehend. The time for waiting and hiding had brutally ended. News of Sumanguru's latest atrocities, the burning of sacred groves, the enslavement of entire lineage groups in increasingly brutal numbers, finally shattered the already fragile peace of the region. Sundiata knew that to defeat sorcery, he needed more than raw courage or a few loyal retainers. He needed absolute, total unity, a concept foreign to the constantly feuding mandinka clans. Messengers, riding the fastest ponies they could find, were dispatched across the vast dust-choked plains, carrying the same urgent, terrifyingly simple message: join us, or face total extinction forever. The response was hesitant at first, thick with suspicion. Clan leaders, stubborn and prideful, remembered generations of bloody feuds and ancient grudges, each unwilling to bow to the other. The Sisay, the Traoré, the Konate, powerful houses all, eyed each other with immense distrust, their histories written in centuries of spilled mandinka blood. But when Sundiata himself finally rode into the great gathering plain near the sacred city of Sibi, everything irrevocably changed. He did not arrive with the swagger of a loud conqueror, but with the quiet, overwhelming authority of a destined savior, radiating a power that transcends mere physical strength. He spoke not of simple vengeance against Sumanguru, but of the absolute necessity of survival, the reclamation of their collective future. His voice, deep and resonating, cut through the nervous chatter like a drawn sword, silencing the squabbling chiefs instantly. He reminded them that the Mandinka people were the true, glorious heirs of the savannah, that their destiny was not to kneel before a dark dictator, but to rise and claim the earth under their feet, shaping it to their will. Sumanguru holds the hammer, he declared, his eyes burning with conviction. But we, the Mandinka, hold the sacred heart. He rules with cold iron, but we shall build our future with pure gold. This monumental address was the spiritual and legal birth of the Mande Charter, the first true unifying constitution of what would become the unparalleled Mali Empire, though the leaders present did not yet grasp the monumental, global weight of that name. The alliance was finally forged, but the military challenge remained staggeringly high. Sumanguru possessed veteran, ruthless armies, armed with the most advanced ironworking techniques stolen from the conquered lands, clad in thick, nearly impenetrable armor. Sundiata, however, had tactical speed and superior knowledge of the terrain. He organized the newly unified Mandinka forces not into scattered tribal militias, but into disciplined, focused fighting wings, operating as one seamless entity.
The expert archers of the Dogon, famed across the region for their lightning-fast reflexes and deadly poisoned arrows, were positioned strategically on the flanks, ready to rain down death from a distance. The heavy infantry, the veteran backbone of the Mema army, held the crucial center line, ready for a grinding, brutal shield wall fight. But the true terror, the revolutionary weapon Sumanguru would never anticipate, was the massive cavalry. The Mandinka horsemen, riding the resilient, fast ponies of the Niger River basin, were trained to strike like lightning and vanish like smoke, utilizing hit-and-run tactics perfected over generations of desert travel. They were the rolling thunder across the vast open plains, an unstoppable wave of muscle and fury, capable of executing flanking maneuvers that would instantly shatter the rigid, slow-moving formations of the Soso Ironmen. Even with the assembled glorious might of the Mandinka tribes, there was still the terrifying reality of Sumanguru's dark magic looming over everything. Rumors persisted that the sorcerer was magically impervious to all mortal weapons, that arrows dissolved before they reached his dark skin, and spears turned to dust upon impact with his armor. Sundiata understood that his war was not just military, it was profoundly spiritual. He secretly enlisted the aid of powerful spiritual leaders, diviners, and griots, seeking the ancient, esoteric secrets that could nullify the dark arts of Soso, searching for the one weakness in the sorcerer's terrifying armor. The Grand Army, now a cohesive, motivated machine of liberation, began its irreversible march toward the heart of the enemy territory, toward Soso itself. It was a procession of absolute defiance. Thousands of warriors moving under the blinding African sun, fueled by the singular, powerful vision of freedom and prosperity. Every mile they covered was a step away from the paralyzing fear that had defined their lives, and a step closer to a new, destined beginning. The air crackled with a dreadful anticipation, the intense, unnatural quiet before the true cataclysm. The fate of the entire West African savanna rested not on the strength of their swords, but on the willpower of the one man who had once been unable to even stand. Sundiata Keita, preparing to face the living embodiment of darkness at the looming, fateful field of Kirana. The air itself tasted of iron and dread. Every man gathered under Sundiata's banner knew they were not marching toward a simple battle, but toward a sacrificial altar, where the fate of all West Africa would be decided by a whirlwind of black magic and blood. Sumanguru Kante, the sorcerer king of Soso, was not just a general, he was a living apocalypse, and his shadow stretched from the Niger River to the edges of the Sahara. The coalition Sundiata had painstakingly assembled was a miracle built on desperation.
It was a patchwork army, exiled farmers, hardened hunters from the deep forests, and remnants of royal houses shattered by Soso's endless conquest. These men had no unified training, only a shared, burning hatred for the tyrant who had destroyed their livelihoods and stolen their sacred objects. They came from Nima, from Ouagadougou, from the scattered villages that still dared whisper the name of the Keita clan, each contingent bringing their own unique weaponry and, more importantly, their own profound, haunting stories of Sumanguru's cruelty. But how do mere mortal men, armed with iron spears and bows, face a king whose fortress walls were allegedly made of sound, and whose personal guards were said to be spirits summoned from the deepest layers of the earth? Sundiata knew that to defeat Sumanguru, they could not rely solely on superior numbers. They had to dismantle the myth first. The true power of Soso was not its army size, but the paralyzing fear it radiated, the belief that Sumanguru was untouchable, immune to mortal steel, a king who spoke only through terrifying prophecy and the shattering music of his enchanted balafon. Legend claimed that this sacred instrument, the source of Sumanguru's rhythmic power, could summon tempests and drive men to madness with a single resonant note. It was a weapon of mass psychological destruction, far more terrifying than any army of horsemen. But Sundiata, the man who had learned patience during his years of exile, had also learned to listen to the winds, to the whispers, and crucially, to the ancient wisdom held by the griots, the keepers of memory. It was through the relentless oral record, preserved and whispered by Jeli Mamadou Kouyate's ancestors, that the critical flaw in the Sorcerer King's armor was finally revealed. Sumanguru's invulnerability was a carefully constructed facade, tied not to divine blessing, but to powerful, specific fetishes and the maintenance of certain taboos, known only to those who dared to defy his spiritual rule. The most immediate threat was the field of Kirina itself. Sumanguru chose the ground meticulously, a place designed to maximize the terror of his charge, where the dust devils danced, and the land felt heavy with ancient, unforgiving magic. The Soso army arrived first, a disciplined, terrifying wave of cavalry, their dark banners depicting stylized, menacing beasts, fluttering ominously in the oppressive heat. They brought their iron smiths, the masters of destruction, whom Sumanguru had forced into service, ensuring Soso possessed the finest, strongest weapons in the entire region. These weapons, forged under duress and imbued with terrible power, were supposed to guarantee total dominance. But as the sun dipped toward the horizon on the eve of the battle, casting long crimson shadows across the impending battlefield, Sundiata delivered his final, desperate address to his motley army. He did not promise easy victory or divine intervention. He promised that they were the intervention. He spoke not of gold or glory, but of the right to stand free, the right to raise their children without the shadow of the Soso axe hanging over their heads. He reminded them of the prophecy, the one that foretold the crippled child rising to save the Mandinka people, a prophecy now reaching its violent, inevitable conclusion.
He detailed the plan, a risky gamble predicated on speed and precision, designed to bypass the physical armor and strike directly at the psychological and spiritual foundation of Sumanguru's power. The plan centered around the use of kondulon, a carefully chosen non-metallic weapon, an arrow tipped not with iron, but with the spur of a white rooster, a simple, absurd object designed to violate a core protective taboo of the Sorcerer King. The sheer audacity of the plan was maddening. To bring down the world's most feared sorcerer with a bird bone and a prayer seemed like a cruel joke, yet it was the only path forward. Sundiata knew that iron, the very metal Sumanguru mastered and drew power from, could not pierce his spiritual defenses. They had to fight magic with cleverness and fear with unshakable resolve, targeting the precise, esoteric weakness of the tyrant.
As the Mandinka coalition settled into their final positions, the night became an auditory nightmare. From the Soso camp, the chilling, discordant sounds of Sumanguru's war drums and the high, piercing wail of the balafon drifted across the plain. It was a soundtrack of inevitable doom, designed to strip the courage from the enemy before a single sword was drawn, paralyzing the hearts of the uninitiated. Men gripped their spears harder, their breath catching in their throats, haunted by the tales of the Soso army's inhuman speed and the way Sumanguru often appeared simultaneously in 3 different locations, striking down commanders before they could even draw breath. But even as the darkness pressed in, a new sound began to rise from the Mandinka lines, the steady, unwavering chant of the griots, led by Bala Faseke, Sundiata's personal storyteller, their voices cutting through the fear. This was the counter-magic, the power of history, the invocation of ancestors, the loud, proud recitation of the Keita lineage, and the promise of a golden future. It was a battle waged not just with steel, but with sound, with spirit, and with the foundational narrative of who would own the future of the savannah. Tomorrow, the sun would rise over Kirina, and the world would either witness the ultimate triumph of tyranny or the impossible resurrection of a destined king. The stage was set. The cripple king versus the sorcerer king. Gold versus darkness. The true heart of the Mali Empire was about to be forged in the heat of a single world-changing morning. Every life, every piece of gold, and every whisper of freedom hinged on the flight path of one small, absurd arrow. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and the entire world held its breath, waiting for the dawn that would either bring salvation or eternal night. The dawn broke over the savannah, but it brought no light, only a suffocating shadow cast by the immense iron grip of Sumanguru Kante. The prophecy had been fulfilled. The final clash between the master of the dark arts and the rightful heir of the lion was upon them, a battle that would decide if the Manden Plateau would know freedom or eternal tyranny under the Sasa king.
Sumanguru stood upon a high mound, his legendary balafon, a musical instrument imbued with terrible power, resting beside him, radiating a chilling, audible hum that froze the blood of Sundiata's warriors even before the charge began. His army was not just men, they were specters of war, animated by fear and fueled by the blackest sorcery, terrifying figures whose iron armor seemed to drink the light, reflecting the sun only as a dull, menacing glow. Sundiata, the Lion King, knew brute strength was useless against a man who could turn into a dozen different beasts or summon tornadoes of sand on command. A sorcerer who had laughed at the conventional laws of life and death for decades. His only hope lay in the intelligence provided by his sister, Nana Treeban, the insider who had secured the single horrifying truth. The Sorcerer King was not invincible, merely protected by a deeply bizarre and ancient totem, a weakness hidden in plain sight. The weapon, prepared in haste and steeped in ritual, under the guidance of the most powerful remaining mandinka seers, was almost comical in its fragility and simplicity. An arrow tipped not with sharpened iron, but with the hardened spur of a pure white cock, mixed with a potent, specific dust derived from a baobab tree that had been struck by lightning in a previous season. An absurdly fragile projectile to fell a demonic giant, but it was the only key to unlocking the Deathless King's defenses and dissolving the magical shields that made him untouchable. The war drums of the Mandinka forces hammered a desperate rhythm, a sound of pure defiance against the overwhelming, oppressive silence of the Soso lines. Sundiata placed himself at the very front, his massive frame no longer crippled, standing as a living, breathing beacon of impossible courage for his men, roaring a challenge that momentarily drowned out the humming, seductive magic of the balafon. The earth trembled as the armies collided at Kirina, but what followed was less a battle and more a chaotic, agonizing test of endurance. Sumanguru's archers fired volleys that defied physics, arrows that seemed to pivot mid-air to seek out the weak spots in armor, guided by unseen, wicked hands. His cavalry, the legendary shock troops of the Soso Empire, were terrifyingly efficient, slicing through the mandinka flank as if it were dry, brittle grass. Every time Sundiata's forces gained a sliver of ground, Sumanguru would unleash a wave of psychological terror, physically shifting the very battlefield around them. At one point, according to the ancient griots, the dust itself rose into the shape of a colossal serpentine dragon, its eyes burning with malevolence, driving the less disciplined of Sundiata's men instantly insane with sheer, paralyzing fear. Sundiata watched his bravest warriors fall, their magnificent courage worthless against the sheer force of pure, concentrated, weaponized evil. The moment was slipping away, the tide turning irrevocably toward eternal darkness and the annihilation of the Mandinka people. Sundiata knew he had one chance, one utterly ridiculous, desperate shot, and he had to take it now, risking the total, immediate collapse of his entire movement on a bizarre, magical hypothesis. He signaled his most trusted archer, a quiet man named Fakoli Kuroma, who had been tasked with carrying the impossible payload. But as the situation deteriorated, Sundiata quickly realized that this was a task too sacred, too crucial for even his most skilled lieutenant. This shot demanded the king's own hand, the culminating act of his journey from cripple to conqueror. Sundiata seized the magnificent hunting bow he carried, drawing the string back until his muscles screamed against the tension. Focusing not on Sumanguru's terrifying ironclad visage, but on the precise, almost invisible spot where the Soso King's spirit was supposedly anchored. His iron hat, which was not just a helmet, but a powerful, highly charged magical container. The arrow, tipped with the insignificant spur of the white cock, flew. It was a silent whisper amidst the deafening roar of war, an almost comical projectile against the backdrop of iron, sorcery, and blood. Time seemed to stop entirely, the very wind holding its breath, as the mandinka forces watched this single, absurd act of faith sail toward the Sorcerer King on his mound. It struck not his armor, which was impervious to mundane metals, but the very edge of his protective iron hat, a glancing, superficial blow that was somehow enough to bypass the primary enchantment. The effect was instantaneous and utterly catastrophic for the Soso King and his dominion. A shriek tore from Sumanguru's throat, a sound not of human agony, but of ancient, powerful magic tearing violently apart at its seams. The air immediately cooled, the oppressive darkness lifted, and the phantom dust creatures instantly vanished into nothingness, leaving only ordinary savanna dust. The immense magical shield that had protected Sumanguru for years, making him functionally immortal and defying every attack, was suddenly and violently shattered by the mundane, anti-magic element of the cock's spur. The spell was broken, and the mighty Sorcerer King was suddenly, horrifyingly, just a man, wrapped in heavy iron, vulnerable and exposed. Seeing their leader struck down, seeing the invincibility vanish like morning mist before the tropical sun, the Soso army immediately broke. Panic, a far greater weapon than any forged sword, ripped through their ranks like a wildfire. They had fought for a dark god, and now that god was exposed as mortal, and their loyalty immediately turned to terror.
Sundiata, seized by a righteous fury that had been suppressed since his childhood exile, charged forward without hesitation. He personally led the relentless pursuit, his battle cry echoing across the fields of Kerina, instantly turning the tide from certain defeat into the greatest, most absolute victory the Mandan had ever witnessed.
Sumanguru, stripped of his protective magic and realizing the depth of his exposure, did not stay to fight as a mere mortal man. He fled.
his movements frantic and desperate, pursued relentlessly by the roaring Lion King, who had finally, against all odds, caught the jackal that tormented his people. The sorcerer ran toward the distant Kulikoro Mountains, his residual power draining rapidly with every panicked stride away from the battlefield. The legends say he did not die by the sword of Sundiata, but was instead swallowed by the earth itself, consumed by the very dark forces he had manipulated, instantly turning into stone, or vanishing forever into a hidden cave, never to be seen again by mortal eyes, thus ending his terrible reign.
The war was over. The great Iron King, the tyrant of the Saso, was annihilated, not by superior force, but by the smallest, most targeted act of magical counter-strategy. The terror that had gripped West Africa for a generation was finally released, and the enslaved Mandinka people erupted in unified, ecstatic celebration.
Sundiata Keita stood victorious on the field of Kirina, bloodied but unbowed, staring out at the fleeing remnants of the most powerful army he had ever faced. He had not just won a decisive battle. He had redeemed his family's honor, fulfilled the sacred prophecy of the griots, and in that single decisive moment, laid the cornerstone for what would soon become the vast, gold-rich, and immortal Mali Empire. The crippled child had become the master of destiny. The age of the mandinka was at hand, forged in fire and magic. The dust had barely settled on the field of Kirina. The ghostly whispers of the defeated sorcerer king, Sumanguru, still echoing across the savannah. But Sundiata Keita was already looking beyond vengeance. He wasn't interested in simply replacing one tyrant with another. His vision was a colossal, terrifyingly organized state, a machine of gold and law that would outlast the stars themselves. The moment he threw off the shackles of the Soso, Sundiata understood that raw military power was insufficient. True power lay in unity, organization, and a set of laws so sacred they could never be broken. He needed a constitution, a foundational myth that could bind the disparate, warring Mandinka clans into a single, unstoppable identity. In a move that shattered every tribal tradition, Sundiata summoned the leaders of the 12 federated clans, the great blacksmiths, the revered griots, and the fearful mystics, to a vast open plain near the ancient heartland of Kongaba. This was not a typical war council. It was the forging of civilization itself, written in blood and iron. For 3 days and 3 nights, under the merciless gaze of the African sun, they hammered out the foundational laws of the Mandan Charter, the Kurukan Fuga. Imagine the staggering scene, 100 powerful kings and lineage heads bowing before the rule of law created by a once crippled child. This was a moment of terrifying submission to a centralized imperial will. The Kurukan Fuga, meaning proclamation of the world, was arguably the most profound legal document in pre-colonial West Africa, a constitution that decreed not just governance,
but mandated social safety nets, protected the marginalized, and codified the very concept of human dignity. It was utterly revolutionary, deeply destabilizing to the old chaotic order, and enforced by the sharp edge of Sundiata's newly loyal army. 30 chapters, 30 sacred oaths sworn upon the ancestors. The charter defined the 16 free clans, the Jantan, or spearholders, who were tasked with defense and governance, and the 5 Marabou clans, the religious scholars, who upheld the spiritual integrity of the state. This established a rigid, yet surprisingly flexible, caste system. The great paradox of the Mali Empire was born here. Built on a deeply hierarchical society, it simultaneously outlawed slavery in certain contexts and fiercely prohibited the verbal or physical mistreatment of captives. Sundiata understood that absolute stability required treating his subjects not just as resources, but as citizens essential to his golden dream. He abolished the brutal, centuries-old practice of taking prisoners as hostages for debt repayment, and insisted that all travelers, regardless of origin, be protected, even mandating that local villages offer them hospitality for 3 full days before questioning their purpose. This wasn't simple morality. It was the foundation of an unstoppable, secure, and regulated intercontinental trade network. Sundiata now stood at the peak, crowned the Mansa, the king of kings, the absolute master of the Mandan. But even a Mansa cannot personally rule a territory stretching 1,000 miles across savanna and desert with mere decrees shouted from Niani. He needed eyes, ears, and iron fists that extended across the Sahara and deep into the dense, gold-rich jungles. To achieve this administrative miracle, the swift conversion of a tribal federation into an empire, he instituted a system of decentralized control married to absolute loyalty. He appointed trusted generals and close relatives as famas, governors, over the key newly conquered regions, granting them immense local authority, yet tying them to the central authority through an unbreakable, lifelong oath of fealty. These famas maintained internal order, collected local taxes, and judged disputes, acting as miniature kings beholden to a grander sovereign. Even more crucial were the farbas, the provincial military governors, who were often stationed at the farthest, most dangerous reaches of the burgeoning empire, the ultimate frontier defense force. These farbas were the true warlords of the Mansa, tasked specifically with securing the constant flow of vital resources and defending the borders from the jealous eyes of neighboring kingdoms like the Masi. Their loyalty was absolute, their power terrifying, and their purpose singular: acquisition and protection. And what resource was the engine that powered this massive reorganization? Gold, of course. The very second Sundiata solidified his political structure, his next strategic move was a relentless, calculated push toward the southern gold fields. This wasn't a war for minor land disputes. It was a war for economic control of the known world. Specifically, he targeted the legendary fields of Bambouk and Bouré,
the traditional sources of mandinka wealth. Before sundiata, these mines were often contested, their output sporadic, and their trade routes perpetually vulnerable to banditry and local squabbles. After sundiata, they became a strict, centralized state monopoly.
He leveraged the immense resource of the Numu, the blacksmiths, who held both technological prowess and fearful mystical power, to meticulously regulate the extraction and initial processing of the alluvial gold. Every ounce dug from the earth was instantly taxed, controlled, and funneled directly into the Mansa's seemingly bottomless coffers. The rivers of the region suddenly flowed not just with water, but with pure, unadulterated economic power. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying in its efficiency. The once crippled boy had not just won a battle, he had engineered an economic singularity, turning dust into the currency that would soon define global trade, setting the stage for an era of unimaginable opulence.
The mandinka sun was rising, and the rest of the known world, from the bazaars of Cairo to the markets of Genoa, was about to be utterly blinded by its unbelievable, immortal, golden light.